Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Just quickly, I'd just like to thank you so much for all of your support on my last video about the I Don't Dream of Labour movement. I was not expecting that at all, and I thank you so much for the lovely comments and for just the reception. It means so much to me and I really can't express it enough, so thank you so much, and thank you so much to everybody who subscribed as well. I was genuinely on 2 subscribers when I uploaded that video, and now I'm on over 60, and it blows my mind. Thank you so very much, and I will continue trying to put forward good quality content to keep you thinking and entertained and what have you. So thank you very much again, and let's just get into it now. So what I'd like to talk about in this video is whether there are in fact solutions to today's modern discontent, particularly looking at the modern discontent which is very evident to me in places such as the United Kingdom and the United States, more broadly speaking. I believe that a notable characteristic of the modern state is that which has been expressed by a political theorist and sociologist, Max Weber. His definition of the modern state centers around this idea that a state is modern insofar as it has monopolized the means of violence. And as we can see in modern democracies particularly, there has been this amassing of not just violence, but also an accumulation of the knowledge surrounding the establishment of nuclear weapons, nuclear arms, etc. So in an age where the state's modernization has meant that our ability to in fact counter its monopoly on violent means has become almost impenetrable, it's very hard for us to in fact find the kind of solutions to many of our discontents and problems in the form of revolution or violent resistance. Simultaneously, I see a modern context in which people are very kind but also very individualistic, and so establishing the kind of collectivism and the kind of unity needed for, say, revolution or a really meaningful impact is quite unlikely. Generally, individuals, especially of the younger generation, have found an escape in the likes of social media forums, identity politics, and subcultures. All in all, there is an evident discontent and dissatisfaction with the way things are. However, simultaneously, there is not an appetite for collective resistance, or at least the kind of resistance that you would typically see, or that the narrative of history tells us is needed in order to change society. There are viable reasons for this. We are so interdependent on modern life, whether it be via our use of modern technology, brands, or just having or wanting a mortgage to buy a house and start a family. Actively resisting means a loss of the little sense of control over our lives and prospects we have established so far. And also, as Margaret Thatcher so perfectly put it, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and their families. Social consciousness, unionism, and long-term collective initiative is well and truly a thing of the past. The individual seems to be here to stay. Imagine our governments sending Gen Zers and Millennials letters summoning them to military service in, God knows, a Third World War. An alternative and quasi-active response has been that of activism. Activism provides a good balance and working relationship between, on the one hand, being a political participant in a society and feeling as if one is making an impact on their context, and on the other hand, allowing an individual to, in fact, be a modern citizen with responsibilities, bills, taxes, needing to hold on a job in order to pay rent, and hopefully allowing that person to have a job which allows them disposable disposable income to afford many of the wonderful and glorious things that modern society gives us. This balance is all well and good, but at the same time, it is a compromise. It is also very much associated with the I Don't Dream of Labour movement. There is clear discontent and dissatisfaction with the way that things are, with the way that humans and our society is treated, and the response is a retreat inward of sorts. In 19th century Russian literature, a staple character and generic trope was the so-called superfluous man. This man was your typical lazy individual, apparently, somebody of aristocratic upbringing who didn't have to work a day in his life and would lounge about just thinking about some of the more abstract existential questions of the world, but not necessarily doing anything about it. Especially in that they were discontent with the way that things were. They didn't like the way that society was. They often had quite a social conscience of sorts. They saw the huge disparities within their society. They saw many restrictions on their freedom, particularly their freedom in expressing their literary talents. Ivan Goncharov's novel Oblomov is such an example. Our protagonist by the same name is just such an individual. Oblomov is a kind and upright man, but unwilling to take action. Despite his discontent with society, he prefers to lead an idle and quiet life. He hardly ever gets out of bed and chooses instead not to interact with the world in any meaningful way. Moving into the early 20th century, European and American modernism gave a space for the intellectuals of the time to explore the disillusionment and discontent which they were feeling with a society that had just emerged from the First World War. A society that didn't necessarily have any concrete identity, in which a lot was happening contextually. The younger generations either consuming their books or going to their lectures at prestigious universities were just as disillusioned and discontent. There wasn't necessarily a concrete sense of patriotism. There were a lot of ideologies and perspectives going around, from communism to National Socialism. The same can be said for the context and sense of disillusionment following the Second World War. Schools of thought such as decadence, Albert Camus' absurdism, and the most noteworthy existentialism gave a voice to many individuals in these societies. Existentialism, for instance, seemed to rarely address and say something to a younger generation's dissatisfaction with very outdated moral standards and systems. Such systems also included colonialism, civil disobedience and resistance, non-cooperation, and particular forms of non-violent resistance, such as Gandhi's Satyagraha, were and have always been attractive to young generations on realizing the darker traits of modernization and its society. What is important about some of these historical schools of thought is that their intellectualism and solutions were concentrated among and relevant particularly and notably only to the intellectual classes in which they emerged and flourished within. There had to be an element of pre-established social privilege in order for somebody to live and understand the philosophy of existentialism. Having the time, and notably the leisure time, to enjoy and understand Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir is not something that the majority of humankind has the time for. Other schools of thought at the time, such as nonviolent resistance, offered a form of very extreme non-cooperation. Sadly, oftentimes these would end in violent tragedy. Some would say that the 21st century looks very much like the early and later 20th century, in that there is not necessarily a solution to many of the problems faced by individuals in modern societies, particularly that of growing extensive inequality. Rather than intellectualism being exclusively that of particular classes, it seems that intellectualism has now become more marketized and is largely based on a business mindset rather than one of enlightening individuals or providing a space space to explore thought and alternative ways of living. You go to school and to college or university in order to become qualified so that you are more attractive to a particular employer. You don't go to learn about the intricacies of Simone de Beauvoir's particular interpretation of existentialism. Or maybe you do, and if you do, however, what I would like to really talk about in this video is the current disenchantment and disillusionment which one can see in China, particularly mainland China. What I find interesting about modern day China is that the disillusionment and discontent is something that is being expressed and dealt with not by, in the case of Europe for instance, a very exclusive niche of very intellectually minded individuals, or by those with a certain level of social and economic privilege which allows them the time and space to explore what can be done about their disillusionment. Rather, those who are openly expressing their discontent are from small towns and from relatively humble backgrounds. These individuals use their grades and education in order to then advance into university education in big urban cities. They then use this education to obtain jobs in these big urban cities. Within this technologically proficient demographic are also workers working in manufacturing jobs. They make up the backbone of China's multinational industrial sector. This is very interesting to analyze, particularly in that this disenchantment is manifesting itself in the form of what is translated in English as the lying flat movement. The lying flat movement makes it representative in a way which I do not believe the I Don't Dream of Labour movement is able to. I believe this is down to context. When the same levels of pressure and societal expectations are imposed on both aspiring social climbers and also on working class millennials, and importantly, both are just as heavily disenchanted in being unable to afford a basic property, a vehicle to marry or to even have children, a kind of common struggle is able to flourish in the way which we see in China today. The case of mainland China epitomizes a central problem with many modernizing societies. That is, rapid economic growth has only been possible at the expense of the promises of universal prosperity it initially claims to be in aid of. The disenchantment of young Chinese nationals is something which I think the modern world really needs to take seriously from this point onward, especially given the growing and inevitable influence of China on world politics. A ruthless economic model of rapid industrial development, coupled with a one-party authoritarian state system, has advanced China from a poverty-stricken rural oasis into a modern economic phenomena. Recently, you may have seen or read that the Chinese Communist Party, the CPC, is now allowing its citizens to have 3 children. Married couples are now legally allowed to have 3 children, which is an advancement from their 2016 policy, which allowed married couples to have 2 children. This all follows on from China's notorious one-child policy. Theoretically and at face value, this seems to be a good advancement and a good response to an aging population and a decline, an extensive decline in birth rates. However, practically and looking realistically at the context, the 2016 advancement in the one-child policy to a 2-child policy and the very recent 3-child policy fails to really address the issue of the birth rate in China. And these policies have in fact failed to, in any meaningful and impactful way, alter China's demographic. Statistics show that the 2016 two-child policy failed miserably to impact the birth rate in any way, shape or form. Simultaneously, a younger generation of Chinese nationals are beginning to take part in an online social movement and protest. An unrelenting culture of overwork, its aftermath and consequences is a hot topic in China today. China's labor force is not only shrinking and greying, but is also tiring of the, for most of us, unimaginable grind summarized as the 996 culture. This stands for a 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. workday, 6 days a week, and has been notably promoted by Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. The new three-child policy was openly criticized by users of China's main social media platform, Weibo. Young Chinese, fed up with what they see as limited prospects in the face of grueling work hours, a trend of conspicuous consumption and skyrocketing house prices, are choosing to do the bare minimum instead. So instead of striving to buy a house, car, or even start a family, they're rejecting it all to lie flat. From white-collar workers in China's bustling cities to university students, an army of frustrated young people are taking to social media and internet message boards in order to declare themselves lying flat youth. Now, this resistance to overwork in the face of little to no benefits was first brought to media attention in China by a now censored post by an anonymous user on a media platform, Weibo, going by the name The Kind-Hearted Traveler. This kind-hearted traveler claims that they have been living according to and abiding to the tenets and main characteristics of the lying flat movement for the past 2 years. For the past 2 years, they have refused to work, they have lived on 2 meals a day, and they have lived on the equivalent of $31 per month. This online user claimed that only by lying flat can individual human beings become the measure of all things. A consequence of this has been an improvement in their mental and physical health. From this post stems and enters the lying flat movement. And according to a very recent survey undertaken by Weibo from May 28th to June 3rd of this year, which included 241,000 participants, 64% of them claimed that they embraced and would embrace fully the lying flat attitude. This interestingly coincides with the growing influence of Song or doomsday culture among China's younger generations. China's young people, having grown up under the one-child policy, are now expected and encouraged to have more children. They're expected to now have up to 3 children, to work longer hours, and to work more years than their predecessors and parents. Their predecessors make up 45% of the population. They are now retired or retiring and are wholly dependent on this younger generation and on their younger children to support them financially in their older lives. They are also living longer, which means a longer time frame in which they need support from their offspring. This is a hell of a lot of pressure. This imminent doomsday culture is characterized by young people's reduced work ethic, a lack of motivation, and an apathetic demeanor due to the pressures of a modern life which rewards them with nothing but greater social controls and broadly defined futuristic expectations. So based on my research, I can identify 6 main characteristics, traits, or principles associated with the lying flat movement. This also includes traits and attitudes adopted by people subscribing to it. So marriage entails being able to provide for another person, not just emotionally, but also financially and in terms of security and property. For many young Chinese people, particularly young Chinese men, there is an expectation with marriage comes property in the form of a house or a home. Unfortunately, for many young Chinese nationals, this is not a viable option because of the extortionary housing prices in China, particularly in these urban megacities such as Beijing, Shanghai, etc. With marriage comes the expectation of family, which itself means more costs, not just in terms of family planning, as in having children, but also in terms of being able to provide for older generations, for your parents. In any modern society, but particularly in China, marriage entails a great deal more than merely being with the person who you've set your sights on and have decided to marry. Marriage increases the cost of living exponentially. Now, the idea of anti-consumption is very central to what the kind-hearted traveller was saying. Within their original post, there was this idea that if you can't change the system, then ignore the system. By this, I mean a system of a meritocratic narrative. The narrative that if you work hard, if you put into society, society will give back to you in the form of meritocratic rewards, such as a house, a car or two, security and financial security, particularly in old age. According to the lying flat movement or the Tangping movement, one should not buy a car, one should not buy a home, one should not apply for a mortgage, one should not subscribe to meritocratic rewards in any shape or form. To accept the meritocratic narrative and its rewards is to uphold the moral values and the mainstream system of modern society. Now, this point very much aligns itself to my first point about marriage not being an aspiration for the lying flat movement. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this, because I find this to be a fascinating concept and idea and struggle that many modern societies are going through. According to the lying flat movement, working toward being able to provide for a family and toward being able to create a family of one's own in the form of children is pointless, and it is something that should not be an aspiration, because it is something that cannot be afforded in any viable shape or form. I found this idea very interesting, particularly in my observation of it in a film and book called Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada. In short, it's based on a true story of a couple who wrote postcards in defiance of Nazi ideology and in Nazism in general. What was interesting is that they waged a form of silent resistance on their own terms, because they observed that they could not in any way trust those around them. There is this issue in very high security, surveillance, authoritarian states in which nobody can be trusted, because in a way, by dividing everyone, by atomizing everyone and making everybody feel that they cannot in any way trust or find a confidant in another citizen, everybody becomes the system. Everybody becomes a form of surveillance. Nobody can be trusted because the system has taken over life to such an extent that everybody is the system. I believe that this definitely applies to China. This immediately brings to mind China's infamous social credit system, in which each citizen is given a score. They start off with a particular number of points, and from there the government determines whether their points are deduced or added up, and this contributes to whether they are able to benefit from some of society's necessities or goods, such as internet speed or being able to fly and travel to certain places. You are alone among strangers with no clear gain or end. So according to the kind-hearted traveller, when revolting against the system is impossible, but simultaneously individuals have to live within a stifling and unbearable situation and existence, the only thing left to do is to just lie down. In this is also embedded the notion of cutting all communication or outside communication, being just with yourself, accepting this atomic state of existence and finding some semblance of meaning in it. Netizens, or China's Gen Z, seem to be merely hustling and involved in hyper competition. They seem to recognize that they can't resist the hard power and the overt influence of the state on their lives and prospects. And it is also recognized that it is impossible or nigh impossible to resist the cultural expectations placed on them. Nonetheless, this does not mean that they can't carve out a little something of meaning for themselves. And this is where working to survive comes in. One is not working in order to aspire toward gaining the rewards that are given by the meritocratic rewards and narrative, but rather one is working in order merely to make ends meet. There is a recognition that a compromise has to be made, but the compromise should be as much on your terms as is possible and viable. Now, this anthropomorphic frog has been a meme and character in many different countries and cultures, meaning different things to different people. Personally, I have not come across Pepe the frog until very recently. Apologies if I'm pronouncing the name of the frog wrong. But nonetheless, in China, Pepe symbolizes the disenchantment, the hopelessness and disdain which many young Chinese netizens feel. A very interesting difference which I see between China, modern China, and Western Europe, for instance, and the United States, is that rather than modern society, in fact, inducing a response in the young citizens, which it depends on, of positivity and mindfulness and good vibes only, in China it seems to be the complete opposite. It seems to be more of a drive toward dealing and coping with the pressures of modern life via pessimism and dark humor, very, very dark humor. This is a fascinating phenomena that I'd like to do a separate video on at some point. But in brief, netizens in China often take popular adult cartoon characters from banned US television or net series, particularly from, which I could find, BoJack Horseman and King of the Hill, particularly Bobby from King of the Hill and BoJack from BoJack Horseman. These US adult cartoon characters are completely revolutionized and morphed into something that is relatable to a Chinese young audience. They are turned into memes because they embody a type of pessimism or a type of failing at life, particularly modern life. Now, in this, Sang culture is very much associated, I believe, to the lying flat movement. Known as Sang or funeral culture, the internet phenomenon encourages a sense of defeatism, despondency, burnout, and even a sense of aloof detachment, often presented with dark humor. The self-mocking, ironic memes, often using characters with sad or despondent expressions, reflect the status of many Chinese youngsters who hold a dim view of their future prospects, often surrounding concerns over career or marriage. Just give up, the memes essentially say. And that is what at face value Sang culture is, and what at face value the lying flat movement is. It seems to be a giving up. But when looking at it a lot deeper and below the surface, it is a form of quite extraordinary resistance, a kind of resistance which the hard power of a state system backing the tenets of modernity cannot viably counter. How can a state fight against people who are doing nothing? What this all boils down to is the very concise definition of lying flatism given by the South China Morning Post. The attitude seen to represent a silent protest to unfairness, often the result of structural and institutional factors that can no longer be altered by personal efforts. The lying flat movement seems to be an extension of Sang culture, which emerged prominently in 2016. In terms of the year, Sang culture coincides with the two-child policy being introduced, similarly to how the three-child policy introduced this year seems to coincide very effectively and not coincidentally, in my opinion, with the lying flat movement. Whereas Sang culture provides an outlet for the repressed frustrations and anxieties of very misanthropic individuals who are justified in their misanthropy and use dark humor in order to express their frustrations. The lying flat movement has converted much of this misanthropy into a type of living, into a type of lifestyle, and even potentially a viable philosophy. Now, there are a few downsides to Tangping which I do see and which I will explore now. Firstly, movements that are online do not necessarily represent in any meaningful way the real concrete world. And secondly, recent historical examples demonstrate that movements or forms of protest which are primarily based online or originate from the internet have a difficult time of distinguishing themselves from being mere trends. As already said, this movement was instigated by a now viral post by the kind-hearted traveller. Now, in some of the remaining fragments from this post, the kind-hearted traveller claimed that, and I quote, "Lying flat is justice. I can just sleep in my barrel, enjoying a sunbath like Diogenes, or live in a cave like Heraclitus, and think about Logos." I feel that the spirit of this movement is also very much down to its context. I think, for instance, if the lying flat movement were to make its way across the seas and into the United States or into the United Kingdom, it wouldn't have the same effect. And I feel that in our context, it would very much be a mere trend. I think the context and the situational context of China is very unique to it and very specific. Secondly, China's economic growth cannot only be attributed to its young and emerging professional class or simply to globalization, which has been at the forefront of China's advancement, particularly in bringing major international corporate manufacturing into the mainland. Much of it is down to the sacrifices and compromises that the CCP has willingly made on behalf of its citizens. My vision of the lying flat movement brought the harrowing image of a 19-year-old archaeology student named Wang Weilin standing fearlessly in front of a row of armored tanks during the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. Non-violent resistance against an uncompromisingly violent opponent often ends in tragedy and failure. However, being a little more optimistic, what I find to be incredibly intriguing here is that hard power, yes, is effective against non-violent resistance in the quote-unquote physical world. However, military might and so-called tactics of hard power have not proved themselves successful at defeating virtual protest and virtual opponents. This is one advantage of the internet, particularly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, in the context of China, in the context of a highly censored and surveillanced internet, in which somehow one individual is able to put forward this manifesto of sorts, which has really created a sort of movement among many a young person. What this movement represents is not outright revolutionary resistance or overt violence, but, as Associate Professor Sin-Hin Chu wrote, a form of non-cooperative resistance against the ethic of hard work that authorities have promoted to spur on the working class since the beginning of China's reform and opening period 40 years ago. In a country such as China, the use of the internet to circulate buzzwords such as involution, lying flat, and 996 is a unique form of resistance in and of itself, based purely on the response of the CCP. What is also interesting is that the CCP's historical ethic of collectivism is also inadvertently being turned against it. Collectivism has been at the core of China's economic model and system. The idea of sacrificing the individual to the collective and to the rapid and ruthless advancement and development of China into a global superpower. Now, this collective, particularly in its younger generation, is resisting this collective of China's working class youths. So contrary to the Western I don't dream of labor movement being very much a middle to upper class type of phenomena, this movement has been able to incorporate many young people from many different backgrounds. I noticed this particularly on reading comments comments that were made by Chinese nationals on a website in which I was reading about this movement. We have always been told that if you study hard and work hard, you will make it up the ladder, get a high-paying job, and things will be more secure. Young people in China believed it at first because the China economy was growing fast, and it was apparent that people's lives got better. But now, as China's economic growth slows down, young people are made to work harder but not getting the reward for it. Young people are now starting to realize this and giving up. Same thing with HK, Hong Kong youths. Do you really believe if they study hard and work hard, they can really earn more than 30,000 yen a month? With 30,000 a month, can they even buy a decent-sized flat? At the same time, all they see is children of wealthy people chilling and showing off on Instagram, and those kids earn more in a month by sitting around than the amount the hard-working people earn in a year. How will that motivate them? Deng Xiaoping, a former paramount leader of the People's Republic of China, established what is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is the dominant theoretical model underlying modern-day China, and in short, it is basically reconciling Marxist-Leninism with the very specific context of China. There is an appreciation and realization that Marxist-Leninism is fallible. It being fallible means that Marxist-Leninism ought to be adapted to China at its specific time and history, its specific context, its specific needs. Every paramount leader's utilization of socialism with Chinese characteristics is therefore specific to their time, specific to their leadership. For instance, Deng Xiaoping's theory refers to Deng Xiaoping's interpretation and incorporation of socialism, Marxist-Leninism, into the Chinese context of the day. Deng Xiaoping is also accredited as being the first leader of China to, in fact, open Chinese markets to international competition, to introduce the free market economy into China, and thus leading the way towards China's modernization. His theory is also responsible for advancing the institutional principle known as one country, two systems. In this sense, modern China is by definition one country, two systems. Now, why this is important to consider is because every paramount leader of China has their theory. Deng Xiaoping had his theory and Xi Jinping has his theory. Now, for many in the lying flat movement, Xi Jinping's theory is not convincing. Xi Jinping gave a detailed ideological vision and speech in 2013 titled "Uphold and Develop Socialism with Chinese Characteristics." In April of 2019, the speech was published on the front pages of all China's state-run papers and news outlets. According to Xi Jinping, Chinese leaders need to have faith in the eventual dominance and success of socialism. Proper communists must at all times be devout in their work. They must be willing to sacrifice everything, up to their own blood, for revolutionary ideals that reach higher than the heavens. In this stems the idea of national or economic rejuvenation. With every leader comes the need to continue China's progress toward the eventual and inevitable victory of socialism over capitalism. More specifically and notably, a Chinese take on socialism over capitalism. Xi Jinping's ideology holds that eventually Chinese socialism will dominate over capitalism because it is superior to capitalism. Basically, history is on the side of China. It is inevitable that China will dominate global affairs and world politics. However, the road toward this progress will be treacherous. Now, this speech is very interesting for the reasons which Xi Jinping gives for the threats to his theory advancing China. Younger generations have two misconceptions which threaten the very existence of China. The first misconception is that the horrors endured by Chinese nationals during the Maoist years or era undermine the credibility of the current party leadership. The second misconception is that socialism with Chinese characteristics is not in any way socialism. These two threats are very much aligned to the lying flat movement, and Xi Jinping's ideology is the complete antithesis of everything which the lying flat movement stands for. Interestingly, whilst giving this speech originally in 2013, Xi Jinping's daughter was attending university at Harvard. The so-called red princelings and princesses born to Chinese political and business elites attend Ivy League universities, are educated in the United Kingdom and the United States at private institutions, go to Oxbridge. They are living in capitalist societies and are living the capitalist dream.
We have to remember, 30 years ago, China was an incipient basket case. I mean, it was total isolation. Having a car was a luxury. I mean, everybody was on bicycle. China is now the biggest market for all the Western luxury brands.
And the new generation now, who haven't actually lived the life of their parents, want to discover something new.
因为我父母他是农民啊，他家跟我过的生活不太一样，天天出去玩的这种日子。我们打算买一部就是往柳的10个座位的商务飞机。
其实岛屿没有这么贵了。
They then seamlessly progress into high power and high paying private sector professions and jobs. The burden of China's collective growth is disproportionately placed on the shoulders of the average national, whilst the offspring of its leaders reap the full benefits of market capitalism, which supposedly socialism is going to conquer. The CCP's fear of the lying flat movement is reminiscent of its general fear that a younger, better educated, well-informed and more individually conscious generation are not willing to make the same sacrifices for the nation as their parents and grandparents before them did in aid of China's revolutionary vision. This can be seen quite clearly in the failure of the 2016 two-child policy to impact China's birth rate in any meaningful way. So the lying flat movement represents a very unorthodox form of resistance. It is inherently non-confrontational, but it is also inherently inactive. In my opinion, it is mistaken for laziness, but that is for you to decide. I think that in it being mistaken for laziness, this is actually to its advantage in the long term. I believe that the very severe and rapid response of the CCP's censorship to this movement demonstrates that it is not laziness at all, that it does pose a potential threat. Since May, over 2 million users, individual users, have somehow accessed either photographs, either the manifesto, memes, quotes, references to this movement, even though every trace of it has been allegedly removed from Chinese media sites. The word involution and Neijun went viral in January. The lying flat philosophy is a buzz phrase. One Chinese media outlet actually called it a silent and blameless movement, which is to its advantage again. I say this because there is no evident target to go after. Who is, for instance, the kind-hearted traveller? Who are the individuals behind spreading this philosophy? It is everyone but no one. Online media censorship can only go so far. It cannot have power over the information and the ideas which individuals take from it. It has no power over the spread of ideas, particularly in the face of a highly tech-savvy and adaptive generation who are increasingly influencing the narrative of society through Chinese social media. Posts made on Weibo relate the movement to Kafka, and it does all sound very Kafkaesque. A journalist named Yi Kai writes in Caxton, "It, lying flat, is a retreat tactic used by those reluctant to involve themselves in society's exhaustions, unwilling to let their already worthless lives be repeatedly depleted. A life of involution or intensification without advancement is increasingly being deemed as worthless and draining. On the contrary, a life of volition, insofar as lying flat may, taken at face value, be deemed worthless, but it at least isn't draining or disheartening." Yi Kai continues, "Nothing is more lamentable than a dead heart, but dead hearts are exactly what today's youth have when they choose to lie flat. This is the biggest problem in society today." I mean, there is something heavily amiss when the red princelings and princesses of China's elites are held up as examples for others to follow, are held up as success stories, when in fact meritocratic earnings, meritocratic narratives are not in any way reflecting the real life experiences and expectations and failures which young people are having to endure. There is a disconnect between the meritocratic narrative which the Communist Party continues to preach and the reality experienced by the vast majority of China's younger generations, and the CCP's willingness to both deny and suppress any criticism of the fact merely adds fuel to the fire of a labor force increasingly alienating itself from its propagandistic ideals. So, what next for this movement? I do have far more of an optimistic feeling surrounding this movement relative to the I Don't Dream of Labour movement. More than anything, I find this to be a very interesting and tactful response to the zero-sum game of modern life. I don't necessarily think that this can be mimicked in a liberal society in as meaningful and disruptive a way as in China. I believe this is down to very different cultural expectations, greater internet freedom, and the general paranoia of authoritarian countries when confronted with any degree of revolt. There is, for instance, the continuing influence of song or funeral culture within China and also abroad. Song tea is a perfect example. This chain of tea rooms has been incredibly successful in Chinese cities and in Australia, mainly because of the names, the idiosyncratic names that they give to their drinks. They have interestingly incorporated song culture into the aesthetic and branding of their drinks, which has been of great success and appeal to young Chinese citizens. Such names as Achieved Absolutely Nothing Black Tea, My Ex's Life is Better Than Mine Fruit Tea, and the No Hopeful Promotion at Work Oreo Black Tea have attracted a young clientele not only to the business but also to a kind of mutual understanding and a cultural recognition of a common point of suffering and disillusionment. I cannot emphasize how I find this to be so interesting, so intriguing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Unfortunately, due to the censorship, finding any information about this movement that goes beyond everything that I have put into this video is very difficult unless I'm looking in the wrong places. And so I would be fascinated to hear what any of you have found or what any of you just think in general. China is going to inevitably play an even greater role in global politics and in our everyday lives. And I think that it is only right that we understand not just China as Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, but particularly China as a country of very diverse, hardworking, intelligent, different, dynamic individuals. And at least from this movement, I am under the impression that a large segment of individuals are very unhappy and are very discontent, and I think that that needs to be spoken about and taken seriously. Nonetheless, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.